Well, Maria Tamboukou is also a co-director of the Centre for Narrative Research at the University of East London. And I should take this opportunity to say that Corinne, Molly and Maria are going to have a joint inaugural lecture on the 25th of May at the University of East London. Well worth going to if you get the opportunity. It would be a real lovely occasion, I think. And Molly is a professor of feminist studies in this.
Maria.
Sorry.
Too many M's.
Too many M's, sorry. Molly is not a professor of feminist studies. Maria is a professor of feminist studies. And she works very much in the area of critical feminisms. And in recent years, she's been very concerned with women artists and thinking about narratives to do with their lives, drawing on Foucauldian and Deleuzian frames very much. And her recent writing has been to produce 3 texts on women artist narratives, as well as an edited collection which is on the limits of narrative coherence. And one of the reasons that I very much wanted Maria to be speaking today is that she is one of the few people I know who makes a very convincing case about why narrative analysis should not focus on identities per se and on the constructions of identities. And I think that since I'm very interested in narratives and identities, but yet I find her persuasive, that it's very, very much worth hearing what she has to say. Another reason is that Maria is also somebody who is very clear about what is not narrative analysis. And so that even, as I said before, though so many people now talk about narrative, Maria draws a line between sensibilities to do with narrative and actual narrative analysis. And today she's going to talk about under history, memory and forgetting, under memory and forgetting, life. But writing a life is another story, in completion. And this is a quote from Ricoeur.
Yeah, this is actually the last verses from his book on memory, history, forgetting. And as you can see, it's a very long text, 500 pages, and at the end, that's how he ends. And when I read it all, and I was very cross with him because he had mentioned something like 2 women, one of them who was Arendt, I was still taken by this work. And I was very lucky that Molly ended up with this, what I will later call about a portrait of moment in Berlin and a portrait in history, because she also problematized what it is to, how can we talk about history and memory and commemoration and mnemonic practices. So I was very lucky to be just after her. So I started writing this paper being intrigued by your question, what is narrative? So I thought about the way I have problematized this question throughout my work. One of the most frequently posed questions in the burgeoning field of narrative research is the simple ontological one, what is narrative? Drawing on the tradition of narratology, narrative researchers have attempted to address this question and have come up with a variety of answers and definitions. Despite the different angles that narratives have been looked at from, however, there seems to be a consensus as to the importance of this question, which needs to be continuously raised and explored. As I said, throughout my work I have interrogated this consensus around the primacy of the ontological question. Instead, I have put it in brackets and have raised questions that are much more pertinent and interesting for me in my analysis. What do narratives do? How have they emerged? What are the possibilities of becoming other? In tracing conditions of possibility that have historically shaped conceptual understandings of what a narrative is, sequence emerges as a dominant theme. Drawing on the sequential canon, researchers have suggested that narratives should be understood as organizing a sequence of events into a whole, so that the significance of each event can be understood through its relation to that whole. The triangle of sequence, meaning, representation thus creates a conceptual framework within which narrative research is being placed. This framework seems to be shaken, however, within the post-narratological scene, where the sequential condition is interrogated, meaning is decentered, and representation is problematized. These questions are particularly important for people like me who I'm interested not just in how we read stories and how we analyze stories and how people tell stories, but also how then we tell stories about these people or we write stories about these people. And this is an area I really think has not been explored very much. So, in this light, there has been a shift of interest from the ontology of what is to the historical ontology of how it has emerged and historically constituted, and I refer to Foucault, of course, here, further moving to the ontogenesis of how it works, with what effects, and what are its possibilities of becoming other. And these are my two theoretical references to Foucault in terms of historical ontology and to Deleuze through ontogenesis. It is, I argue, on this transitional ground, from ontology to ontogenesis, that the conceptual triangle of sequence, meaning, representation should be interrogated, and narratives should be theorized as entities open to constant becomings, stories in becoming. In this light, it is to the consideration of process rather than sequence that the interest in narrative research should shift a little. I'm not saying we should abandon sequence, but I'm also saying we should consider process. Process as an organizing plane derives from a conception of time as simultaneity and duration, a time where past, present, and future coexist in the noun of narratives, the portrait of moments that Molly was talking about. Narratives are therefore taken as events that express moments of being crystallized into narrative forms. Virginia Woolf has given us very good examples of these moments of being and how they can become stories. These narrativized moments, however, create conditions of possibility for more stories to emerge. As Hannah Arendt has poetically put it, the world is full of stories of events and occurrences and strange happenings which wait only to be told, and the reason why they usually remain untold is lack of imagination. Narratives are indeed at the heart of how Arendt conceptualizes the human condition, and Molly already referred to her work. Drawing on the Aristotelian notion of energia or action, Arendt's thesis is, as Kristeva explains, that action as narration and narration as action are the only things that can partake in the most specifically human aspects of life. As the only tangible traces of the human existence, stories in Arendt's thought evade theoretical abstractions and contribute to the search of meaning by revealing multiple perspectives while remaining open and attentive to the unexpected, the unthought of. And already Corinne, Julia, and Molly have referred to this unpredictability of stories. As Olivia Guaraldo has written, stories respect the contingency of action and express the unpredictability of the human condition. In doing so, stories ultimately reconfigure the sphere of politics as an open plane of horizontal connections wherein the past can be remembered and the future can be reimagined. This is how I am led to my own work, what it means to narrate the moment or event, to tell stories whose end you do not know, but you actively want to reimagine, and hence my fascination with the notion of narratives as portraits of moments in writing about women's life stories. I've always worked with letters and diaries, and all I have analyzed were moments rather than complete stories. Now, the notion of the portrait of moment comes from Hannah Arendt's biography of Rachel Varnhagen, The Story of a Jewish Woman. The book was first published in 1957 when Arendt was already living in the States, but it was actually her second doctoral thesis, the habilitation that she had to complete to work as a German academic. Her supervisor was Karl Jaspers, and following his idea of problematizing what it means to be German, Arendt wanted to problematize Jewish identity, and particularly the problem of Jewish acculturation. She thus studied Rachel Varnhagen's letters and diaries, and then wrote her story, interweaving disparate moments and events into a drawing that had a meaning. That's one of her expressions. So it's still possible to write about identities. But is it possible, Adriana Cavarero has asked, to tell a story that has a meaning? This was my challenge in writing a genealogy of the female self in art, where I mostly drew on women artists' letters and diaries, which I conceived, theorized, and analyzed as portraits of moments, linking them to another significant proposition, what Arendt has called writing a life from within. And I will talk about it now. In her approach to life writing, Arendt is not concerned with the narratologist's obsession with sequence, particularly temporal sequence. She actually thinks that stories should reveal what sequence often covers. She writes, "The story reveals the meaning of what otherwise would remain the unbearable sequence of sheer happenings." Rather than following the imperative of the beginning, middle, and end of the Aristotelian poetics, Arendt's interest lies with the importance of narrative agency and closure in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. As Julia Kristeva pithily notes, in this philosophical text, the art of narrative resides in the ability to condense the action into an exemplary moment, to extract from it the continuous flow of time and reveal a who, the uniqueness of the human being. This interest in freezing the exemplary moment, now comes Corinne, wherein human beings reveal themselves to the world through action and speech, also differs from Ricoeur's theories that focus on the interrelation between temporality and narrativity. While Arendt's interest lies in the moment of action and speech, Ricoeur emphasizes the importance of the plot in the formation of narrative identity, and dismisses the now, and this is a quote from Ricoeur, as concealing the true constitution of time. So there is a huge difference in their approach. Although Arendt highlights the importance of stories in creating meaning, she makes the distinction between revealing meaning and defining it, thus pointing to the impossibility of pinning down what stories are about or what subjects should be or do. It is true, she notes, that storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it. But it has to be noted here that meaning is an existential concept in Arendt's philosophy and remains rather elusive. So this is something we still need to work on, and Jens Brockmeyer has worked on it, but I think we still need to work more. Still, who is this evasive meaning addressed to? Who is the audience of these stories? Sheldon Wallin has commented that for Arendt, audience, and this is a quote, audience is a metaphor for the political community whose nature is to be a community of remembrance. In this light, it is important to remember that closure for Arendt refers to the power of stories to reveal the meaning of action and thus complete the action. It's not about the completion of the story, the end, the Aristotelian telos or telos. Lilian Weisberg has commented that for Arendt, biography reflects on an individual life, but as Molly said, this life becomes public for history. But how can this be done? How can you work from within, writing a story from within, while you also write for history? Arendt's approach is controversial here, in that she attempts to write about inner lives, rejecting both psychoanalysis and psychology. She was really allergic to both of these terms. As Weisberg notes, instead of a psychological analysis, Arendt proposes a turn outward to the mimetic gesture. She addresses the notion of action and speaks of the public self in terms of performance. In writing Varnhagen's life from the inside, Arendt did not discuss external facts unless they were absolutely necessary. But she did not write within the biographical discourse of introspection either. So some of the tensions that Julia has talked about come very intense in her work. She was interested in the life and actions of the mind, not of the soul or the psyche. The biographer, she has argued, has to respect the life she is writing about and should refrain from investing the biographical subject with meaning she might neither recognize nor understand. How to keep psychology or psychoanalysis at bay while at the same time writing about the subject's inner life has been, of course, a difficult and risky endeavor, but still an exciting path to follow in life writing. And here we have the link to autobiography that Julia also talked about. Arendt never wrote an autobiography. However, Varnhagen has been considered and discussed as coming very close to an intellectual autobiography. In writing Varnhagen's biography, Arendt looks at the shape of a life that has been completed and responds to it with intellectual rigor and unbounded passion. As her biographical subject, Varnhagen would ultimately become for Arendt, and I quote from Arendt here, "my closest friend, though she has been dead for some 100 years." But apart from unfolding Arendt's philosophical ideas and concerns through a reflection on Varnhagen's life, what else is autobiographical in Varnhagen's text? As Weisberg has pithily commented, Weisberg is the editor of Rachel van Hagen's biography. Arendt's inner biography was only possible if staged as an autobiography, and I quote here, as a fictitious act seemingly necessary if one wants to come close to a life. To do that, Arendt had to imagine herself as participating in Van Hagen's life, following the public life of her salon, reading, transcribing, and rewriting her letters and her diary entries, discussing the dreams Van Hagen had jotted down, not as interpretations of repressed thoughts or emotions, but as questions that, quote from Arendt, entered the realm of the day and ultimately became narratives of the day. Weisberg therefore observes that writing a story from the inside requires the author to retreat and allow the biographical subject to take the lead. This, of course, does not mean that the authorial intention is completely erased. It rather unfolds in parallel with the voice of the biographical subject, challenging, as Weisberg has noted, the power of the author. So when you write the story of another, you stage a dialogue, and an agonistic dialogue, where you talk, but you also should allow your biographical subject to talk. Arendt wrote Van Hagen's biography very much drawing on her correspondence. Van Hagen's life was thus written in letters, and the notion of the portrait of moment was actually a phrase from Van Hagen's letters. And I quote here, "I want a letter to be the portrait of a moment, that in which it is written." It's also interesting to note here that in her preface to Van Hagen's biography, Arendt uses the notion of the portrait to denote her biographical work. She writes, "My portrait therefore follows as closely as possible Rachel's own reflections upon herself." I have followed Arendt's idea of the portrait in my work, but rather than conceptualizing it as a dyadic relationship between the author and the biographical subject, I have rather drawn on the idea of the portrait as a painting that opens up a performative scene, a dialogic space wherein the subject, the researcher, and the reader meet, interact, and negotiate meaning. In this light, the portrait becomes a site of mediation and communication, enabling the emergence of a multiplicity of meanings and traces of truth. Moreover, the autobiographical subject of the analysis, far from being essentialized, pinned down, or fixed in a position, or limited within the constraints of her story, becomes what I have called a narrative persona, who responds to the theoretical questions and concerns of the researcher without necessarily validating them with the evidence of experience. And I refer here, of course, to Joan Scott's work on problematizing the evidence of experience. Although the initial idea of my notion of the narrative persona comes from a synthesis of Deleuze and Guattari's idea of the conceptual persona of the philosopher, Socrates for Plato, and the aesthetic figure of the artist, Jane Eyre for Brontë, it is in Arendt's work, again, that the concept was ultimately grounded. As Arendt notes in her book on revolution, the roots of the persona are to be found in ancient drama, where it has a twofold meaning, a function. A persona is a mask disguising the actor in theater, and is a device that, although disguising, would allow the voice of the actor to sound through. It is through this second function that the persona enters in Roman times the legal realm, and it means a legal personality, a right and duty-bearing person, a Roman citizen, not any natural person. So what I have in my analysis is the drama persona and the legal persona. In this context, my narrative persona is a dramatic figure, and it is through her story that certain concepts can be rehearsed and dramatized so that their enactment can create a scene for dialogic exchange and interaction. But also in its legal dimension, the narrative persona takes up a position in discourse and assumes her right as a subject. I am ethically responsible towards to her. This positioning does not essentialize her, but creates a person with whom one can be in dialogue, but also to whom one is responsible. And I quote here from Arendt, a right and duty-bearing person created by the law and which appears before the law becomes, in my case, a person created by her narrative, which appears in the order of discourse, but to whom I am accountable, having taken up the responsibility of presenting her story as an Arendtian design that has a meaning. The latter is open to interpretation and negotiation between you as audience, viewers, readers, myself as an author and narrative researcher, and my narrative persona, whose stories should be open to all. Thank you.